All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. Today, we're going to address an issue that I know is on so many of our minds, which is the issue of rising anti-Semitism and what the community can do to address it, what we've been doing, what we can be doing better, what are some of the lessons of the past year. And I can't think of a more dynamic panel than the three that we've assembled here. I'm going to introduce our guests very briefly because we could spend the entire conversation just introducing them because of the achievements collected here. And then we're going to get right into the subject matter. If you have questions, please share them in our chat. We will get to them as soon as we can. We really do want this to be a dialogue and interactive conversation. We'll try to get all the questions that we receive. So as we're talking, feel free to share any questions, and we'll come back to them either during our session or at the end of it. We'll try to capture everything that comes up. So our panelists today for this webinar, first we have Spokoiny, President and CEO of the Jewish Funders Network. Andres is a longtime Jewish communal leader, thought leader, previously worked at the American Jewish Joint Distribution community in Paris, and really one of the people helping us think about this moment and how the Jewish community can transition and do better. And I'm really excited to have Andres' very candid and authoritative views today. We have Dr. Sharon Nazarian. She's a national board member of the Anti-Defamation League, a founder of the Unison Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA, also an adjunct professor of political science at UCLA, where she teaches a course on understanding anti-Semitism through a global lens. She writes and speaks frequently on this topic, and has many different insights, not just from the Jewish community here in the United States, but from communities all around the world. And we'll be hearing some of those insights today. And Sandy Cardin, the founder of a new, very important initiative called Global Jewry. Sandy previously served as CEO of Our Common Destiny, a global effort seeking to unite the Jewish community. He served on many Jewish boards as the leader of some major Jewish foundations, and is currently involved with the JCC Association in North America. Sandy also really has so much depth of experience from our recent past as a community, and I'm very excited to hear his insights. So thank you all for being here. We're really excited for this conversation. So I want to start with sort of maybe the biggest question. We've all watched over the past, however you want to count it, 10, 15 years, as investment in fighting anti-Semitism has dramatically increased. During the same period, we've seen a spike in this hatred to kind of unprecedented levels in recent memory. So what conclusions can we draw and should we draw from this recent experience? I want to start with Sandy, and then maybe some of our other panelists can weigh in.
Great. Well, thank you, Nate. It's an honor to be here and with my friends, the co-panelists, and I think there are really four great leaders on this call. So I look forward to the conversation. Look, I think that when we talk about anti-Semitism, I don't know what the empirical data would say. Andres will be happy to tell me, but I'm not sure but for 20 years, there's been a tremendous investment so much in anti-Semitism. I think very recently, for sure. But when I think back, Nate, about 20 or 25 years ago, when I was out at the Schusterman Foundation, one of the prevailing thoughts at the time of the Jewish philanthropic community is that we didn't need the defense organizations anymore. And by defense organizations, it primarily meant the American Jewish Committee and Anti-Defamation League were really the two. And there were lots of philanthropists who said, they don't need any more money. We don't have that kind of problem here in the United States. Let's focus on Jewish continuity. Let's focus on Jewish identity. Let's not worry about external threats. We don't have any. So that was a prevailing, if not a prevailing, that was a thought, particularly among mega philanthropists back in the day, in the late 1900s and the early 2000s. And then when we began seeing some things happen on campus, I remember when I was with Schusterman and we were instrumental in starting the Israel on Campus Coalition, most people told us that we were overstating the problem, that this wasn't really an issue. It was a concentrated issue. It was only on a few campuses. And please stop shouting to the world that anti-Semitism is a problem, because you're going to ruin things. And by the way, that was a message that came out of Hillel itself. I remember when Richard Joel was still at Hillel and then moving to Avram Minfeld. It's not as big a problem as you're suggesting. You're making it a problem. Tone it down.
Wow.
And so we had a lot of pushback. Third was that at the time, societally, from a progressive movement, Jews we wanted to be loved, right? We wanted to be accepted by the progressives. That was really important. And when we saw the rise of intersectionality, when we saw suddenly Jewish groups weren't going to be allowed to participate in certain things, we poo-pooed it. We did not deal with it right then. We sort of said, okay, we were apologetic. We didn't deal with it head on. And then not only before October 7th, but certainly October 7th, we're in an environment now where I think societally it's okay to hate. It's okay to be divided. It's okay to call out the other person. Those societal norms that were somewhat in place are no longer there. So I think we are where we are because we didn't call out the challenge as it emerged. We weren't direct enough. And now we find ourselves in a spot where societally and civilly, people are divisive, people are full of hate, and we have to deal in that environment. And that's how I think we find ourselves today.
Thank you. I think that's a really important context for the question. Andres or Sharon, is there anything you would add? Lessons we should take or shouldn't take from what we see yeah.
I can go just talking a little bit to your original question, is like this blossoming of organizations fighting anti-Semitism. It's kind of funny, Sandy, like you mentioned, two defense organizations, ADL, AJC. Now at the Jewish Founders Network, we did a survey of organizations fighting anti-Semitism, and we are at 160 and counting.
Wow.
And there is a paradox there, right? Like on the one hand, there's never been so many organizations fighting anti-Semitism, so many resources devoted to fight anti-Semitism, and there was never been so much anti-Semitism. So how do we, there's something there that is not working. And I think that at the bottom of it, I think that, Sandy, you touched into it a little bit when you said that's where the society is at. I think the Jews, first of all, we need to realize that anti-Semitism is not a problem of the Jews, it's a problem of the society. It is connected to the way in which societies define themselves. And throughout history, anti-Semitism was always a key element in how societies defined their ethos and who they were. From the Roman times until Nazi Germany, and here too, in the dominant narrative today, anti-Semitism is not simply that it's okay, Sandy, to hate. It's necessary. Meaning, when you have an ideology that divides the world into oppressed and perpetrators, it is a moral obligation to be against the oppressors. So the moment you define Jews and Israel as an oppressor, you have to hate them because that's the righteous thing to do, right? So we're in a deep problem, and I think that the main message, the main learning I take from this blossoming of anti-Semitism organization and the relative lack of success that we're having. I mean, it's true, we never know what we avoided, right? It's very difficult to be counterfactual here, but maybe it would have been worse without this 106 organization. But I think that we need to realize how complex the problem is. We need to realize that Jews can only impact anti-Semitism in a very limited way, that anti-Semitism needs to be tackled at the societal level by broad coalitions of people, and that if for 4,000 years we didn't manage to solve it, we won't solve it either. So the question then becomes, what can we do? What is it possible to do? What can we achieve? And then I go back to what Sandy said, but in a different way, about defense. In other words, we may not be able to change the world or to change society as a whole in time. I mean, I think that over time you can affect social change, but in the next 12 months we won't. But you can defend yourself. You can, for example, use your power to call out anti-Semitism in campus. You can sue. You can use the law. You can use legislative power. So in other words, I think that, and I guess we're going to be talking about this later, I think that that's a shift that we need to make in our mindset. It's not so much about changing hearts and minds. I mean, it is, but in the very long term. In the short term, is about basic defense of Jewish rights.
That's right. Wow. I want to take the conversation to Dr. Nazarian. I think that, and maybe if I could direct you a bit, you've done fascinating research looking not just at the American Jewish community, but at communities in other geographic locations like Germany and Australia. I'm wondering if you can speak to that experience and how maybe the experience of some of these other communities, smaller, in many cases facing more virulent anti-Semitism for a longer period of time, how have they reacted? And what are some of the lessons we can take from their experience as we think about how we deal with this here in the United States?
Thank you, Nate. Thanks for having me. And it's really a pleasure to be with all of you and obviously my co-panelists. Maybe I'll start by just adding a couple of and building on kind of what Andres and Sandy have said, and then I'll kind of jump into kind of a global lens. My lens is one, both as a political scientist and as someone who's Iranian born, coming from a non-democratic society to a democratic society here in the US that I'm very proud of and, love being an American. And so what I've seen from my lens is that the very tools that hold up our democratic values and institutions have now for the last decade been used against us by bad actors. And we can talk about, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, others. So our technology, our social media, our notion of immigration, all these things. And so we are where we are as a minority here in America at the kind of center and fault lines of some of these challenges being posed to us by external forces with a very clear agenda to sow division, to sow distrust in our institutions, and to really kind of pose us against each other. And Jews historically have fall right exactly in the middle of those cracks. And here we are again. The other thing I would say is my research has shown that, as you mentioned, looking at Germany, when I spent a month in Germany in the month of May, what role do our different tools play? What role do they play in giving us avenues? And what I found through my work and research globally is that October 7th, in many ways, hit global Jewry exactly the same way. The aftermath in the last year of the trends that we've been seeing from what's been happening on campuses, through encampments, through attacks on visibly Jewish citizens, to Jewish businesses, to blacklists of writers and artists and musicians. All of these trends were unbelievably similar. And probably I would say the biggest uniformity was the global mourning, Jewish mourning that happened at the murder of the 6 hostages just a week ago. It was amazing to me to speak to colleagues from Australia to South Africa to Latin America to Europe. We all felt that our children were murdered on that day. It was exactly the same feeling. But what our reaction to what has happened to our societies and communities since October 7th has been a bit uneven. And my assessment shows that those communities who were more resilient, who have faced the kind of trends that we're seeing now globally, such as European countries like in the UK and France, they had muscles that were already strong. And on the other side, you had communities like Australia, and I would say Canada, and in the US even, where we've had these decades of deep integration, of deep security, of deep trust in our institutions, who we are rich communities in every way, and yet we haven't had the need to build these muscles and maintain the resilience and the muscles that perhaps Europeans have had to. So the reaction, the impact on those communities. I mean, I was in Sydney exactly on the 6-month mark after October 7th. That community was paralyzed by those mass demonstrations on October 9th on the steps of the Sydney Opera House, where they chanted "Gas the Jews." And what has happened since October 7th to the Australian Jewish community is one of like complete shock and not knowing what to do about every aspect of their life, from their university to the businesses, to the politicians, to the arts community. I mean, the whole fabric of the arts community of Australia rests on Jewish donors, Jewish philanthropy has always done so. And now, one after another, Jews are leaving those boards. And Jews are feeling unwelcome and isolated and just completely under attack. So the uniformity of the experience has been very similar. The ability to react has been diverse, and some better and some stronger and some more resilient, and others catching up very quickly. And I think to Anna's point about all these institutions being built, this is a reaction to what we're all feeling, is developing those muscles. So I'll stop there.
Can I jump in for a second?
Please,
Because
please.
I think that here's very important about what Sandy said about and this new initiative, Global Jewry. I think that we lose a lot as a global Jewish community when we don't help each other develop those muscles. Meaning, we would have, like the Australian Jewish community and many US Jewish community would have been in a very different place if they have seen what's been happening, for example, in the UK for the last 30 years. I mean, we were like, when I lived in France, I saw the writing on, I mean, it wasn't the writing on the wall, it was a reality, like this alliance between the far right and the far left that basically use the same arguments, right? There's not a far left and a far right anti-Semitism. There's one anti-Semitism, which is a big conspiracy theory. And if you read what a guy like Jason Hinkle says, and what, I don't know, some far left person said, it's basically the same
Mélenchon, yeah, Mélenchon.
Yeah, Jews control the world, Mélenchon, exactly, Mélenchon, Le Pen, it's basically the same thing. So, but we didn't see that because we weren't paying attention to other Jewish communities. We're very parochial. So I think we need to break that. And the other point I want to say to what you said, Sharon, I think what you said about democracy is so important because Jews sometimes have that tendency to say, oh, if there's an autocrat who's pro-Jewish, that's better than a democracy in which you can have somebody with policies you don't like. This is not about policy. This is about institutions. The only success that we have them because there is democracy. In other words, I can go and sue Columbia University because we live in a democracy and I have an independent judiciary. So when you have an autocrat, the autocrat today could be good to the Jews. Tomorrow, it doesn't suit for him to be good to the Jews. He becomes bad. So it's very, very important that whatever we do, we support the democratic institutions because ultimately they are the only guarantee that not the goodwill of who's in power.
And that's a story that echoes through Jewish history from the time of Pharaoh to the Polish, nobles who brought us in to the. I think it's a really powerful, important point. Yes. When we think about our work as communication strategists, I always say there's three elements of every good communications campaign. It's a clear objective, a target audience, and an effective message to move your audience in the direction of your objective. As I look at this, I think so often we get into a very tactical mode, and as you said, kind of everybody looking for a silver bullet, and also not having a realistic view of what our objective should even be, right? And I think what you both have crystallized is this notion that we can't necessarily solve anti-Semitism in a day or a week or a year or a decade or 2 decades or ever maybe, but we have to kind of reframe our objective in some way. So I'm wondering, there's so many different groups, as you said, fighting anti-Semitism, thinking about this. I'm wondering if you could, I want to just throw this to the group. How would you, if you had a magic wand today, how would you allocate or reallocate our focus, energy, resources in terms of target audience and objective as it relates to those audience? Should we be more focused on the Jewish community, on building resilience? Should we be more focused on progressives? I'll let you kind of take the direction or centrists. If you had a notion, I mean, each of you has been in a position of thinking about how do you allocate, resources, or advising folks on how do we allocate resources. I'd love just for your take on that big question, however you want to take it.
Well, let me start, and thank you, Andres, for mentioning global Jewry. I appreciate it, and I do think it's important that we find ways to build stronger connections and collaborations between and among the Jewish community, because I think not only will we learn from one another, we'll have a sense of connection, a sense of community that maybe we don't have, and there's we can also be much more effective in our utilization of resources, and avoid duplication, replication. So if I had the magic wand, Nate, I think first thing I would do is I would bring everyone together. I would bring all 160 groups together, and I would say, look, exactly what Andres and Sharon said. This is a complicated, complex challenge. There is no single answer. And by the way, there is no single audience, and there's no single message, right? We need to tailor our activities and our messages. We need to segment the audience. We need to say the right things to the right people, right? That's what we need to do. And there are plenty of smart people and plenty of resources and plenty of dollars, and there's plenty there. The challenge is that we're all talking over each other and around each other. And whether it's a use of AI and technology, or whether it's a different kind of approach, or this one says this message is the right one, and this one says that's the right one, whatever it may be, it's a coordination, I think, that what we need. And to Andres's point, we're not going to solve it. I mean, it would be great if we could, but we're probably not. But we can do a lot better, and we will do better if we are more coordinated in our response to the challenge, and we work together. Not necessarily, again, unity doesn't mean unanimity. Everybody doesn't have to do the same thing. And as we said, the market is different. We have to segment the market, and we have to provide the appropriate messages for it. But we can do that in a coordinated approach. If we can find a way to do that, and that's one of the dreams of global Jewry. One of the dreams when we set this up is to say, can we be, with no logo and no ego of our own, can we be a convener of these organizations so that they recognize we're all about helping each of them individually as well as collectively? And that's what we're trying to do, but it's very hard in the anti-Semitism area, because everybody thinks they have the answer. And if only they had, if people would pay attention to them, we would get there. We need a more coordinated.
Nate, maybe I'll build on. I totally agree with Sandy, and I'll tell you what I'm spending my time in. My goal right now is to bring the issue of anti-Semitism out of the usual silos. So I'm bringing the challenges and the threats of anti-Semitism to our democratic societies to the climate space. Talking with the climate people about, look at what happened to the human rights space. Learn from that, how the human rights space has been completely captured and lost credibility and legitimacy, and that you're going to go down the same path. Talk to national security people. This is not just a domestic, Jewish problem, as Andres said. We have to pose this as a national security problem for this country, as we're seeing in our cities. Look what's happening in our cities.
Yeah.
I mean, a Pakistani man was just arrested look at the kind of external security threats are coming through the lens of anti-Semitism and attacks on the Jewish community. So this is a national security issue. This is a democracy issue. So coming out of our silos that we've been working in, and exactly to Sandy's point about not only coordinating amongst ourselves, but coming out and speaking to new audiences. We should be at Davos. We should be at all these centers of power around the world and putting this on the table. I attended the Democratic Convention and really insisted on making sure that we have side events speaking about anti-Semitism. Because we know it'd be much more easy for many out there just to put it under the rug and not talk about it. So we have to be speaking in feminist spaces, speaking in LGBTQ spaces, about how anti-Semitism is manifesting and eating them up from inside, and also targeting and attacking their very values, what they believe in. So for me, it's really coming out of our silos.
Yeah, I think that first I'm gonna answer this in a kind of circuitous road, but I think it's important to say that we live in a time of contradictory realities, right? And they're both true. So it is true that there's never been so much anti-Semitism. Is it also true that Jews have never been so integrated in the society? And in a way, despite what we hear, support for Israel is is very, very strong. I mean, what the Biden administration, and love Biden and Harris or hate them, but factually what they did for Israel was more than any previous US administration did. Nixon is a distant second, really, in terms of helping during a war. Nixon gave $3.5 billion. That's a tenth of what the Biden administration did. And after 18 months, forced a ceasefire. Now we're 11 months. Yes, they suspended weapons for 1 week, one of the 350 type of weapons. I'm not saying this to advocate for the Biden administration. I'm saying this for us to realize that there are contradictory signals. On the one hand, we never had so much support. On the other hand, we never had so much anti-Semitism. And we need to live with those two things at the same time. We're having this conversation about the universities. We need to remember that a few decades ago, there were quotas for Jews in Harvard, right? So there is progress in some way, but the progress takes a lot of time. In the meantime, when we decide how to allocate resources now in the crisis, I think that the first thing has to be work with the Jewish community. Like my biggest fear today is not what the anti-Semites are going to do and how. My biggest fear is what anti-Semitism is going to do to Jews. In other words, how it's going to alter the self-perception that Jews have, right? How my kid that is in college is going to be influenced by the anti-Semitic discourse there, that is going to make it either adopt it, God forbid, or hunker down and not show his Jewishness because of fear. That, for me, has to be the first thing. The second thing is, I think, again, we need to be assertive and we need to use defensive tactics. We need to not to be afraid. You know, you all know the joke about the two Jews that are going to be shot, and one is asking, they say we should ask for blindfolds, and the other one said, don't make waves, don't make waves. You know, Jews have to think, let's not make waves. We need to make waves. And when we make waves, things happen. Let's face it, if funders wouldn't have raised a stink over the issues at campus, we wouldn't have the reaction that we had, right? If we don't take people or institutions to court, and by the way, it works for the left and for the right. Amy Spitalnik from JCPA took the neo-Nazis to court and won, and the Brandeis Center is taking universities to court and winning. So we need to put money in those things that uphold Jewish rights. Totally agree with Sandy that coordination is necessary. I mean, is it really not an efficient system out there? 160 organizations, each of them is doing their own research. Each of them is doing, is replicating, duplicating stuff. We will never agree on message. Forget about it. Like, it's not going to happen because we're politically diverse, because we're ideologically diverse, but we can agree on, you know what? Everybody can use their own content, but let's at least use the same platform. If somebody cracks the algorithm, let that information circulate so we can all use it. There is something here that is very important. I think that's the last point, but it's really critical. We are trying, in many cases, especially in the social media battle, we're trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. There's 15 million Jews in the world and 2 billion Muslims, It takes only 0.1% of all the Muslims in the world to outnumber the Jews. I'm not saying that all the Muslims are anti-Israel or and of course not anti-Jewish, but I'm saying when we talk about numbers, we're in a huge disadvantage. And we try to compete on that arena in which we're under a gross disadvantage. I think that the most intelligent operations actually go to the head of the Hydra. In other words, don't try to fight numbers with number on TikTok. Try to regulate TikTok in a way that anti-Semites cannot spread anti-Semitism so easily. And that worked. Like TikTok, Congress took action against TikTok, right? So we need to find ways of circumventing our disadvantages, which are the numerical disadvantages, which are the money disadvantages. Listen, there are 13,000 human bots in Indonesia, in boat farms, tweeting. We don't have that. We don't have the money to pay for 13,000 people 24 hours. And that's just what Qatar is doing. Imagine Iran, China, Russia. There's billions of dollars that we don't have. So we need to be smart and fight in a terrain that is, we can level the playing field.
It's so important, and I think it's so underperceived. It's been reported that Qatar spent $1 trillion in influence operations over the last decade in the United States. And it's not just about Israel, by the way. They have their own, but we are a big and powerful people, but we're not a nation, and the state of Israel shouldn't be engaged in the same thing because it would really undermine its national security. I think that's an important point. I want to drill down on something, sort of bringing together a thread here, and then I want to go to our audience questions. We're getting a few in, and I would just again invite you all, please share your questions with the chat, and we'll get to them right here. But I want to go to something about the resilience of communities that Dr. Nazarian raised, which is, I think, is very important. My view always is, if our only notion of being Jewish is fighting anti-Semitism, we're going to lose. If we just take these kids and we expect them to go to college and fight anti-Semitism, the value proposition is not there. So I guess my question for you all is, to the point that Sandy raised at the beginning on Jewish continuity, is some of the answer to fighting anti-Semitism figuring out how we create more vibrant, engaged, knowledgeable Jewish communities? And do we think that one of the silver linings of October 7th is perhaps that at least from my point of view, there's some percentage of folks who are coming back into the fold in different ways? And are our institutions ready to offer them a value proposition for being Jewish beyond this in a deeper way in this moment of political polarization, declining trust of institutions? And I just wonder if we could address that issue first, and then we'll go to some audience questions. Anyone want to take that?
Maybe I'll start by just talking about, those of us who were born, raised in communities where our Jewishness was front and center every day of our lives, those in the Middle East, those in Europe, those in Latin America. It almost was something that was part of our daily life, right? In Iran, and this continues today with this small Jewish community that's remaining there, we were reminded of our Jewishness every day. And that, in a way, built in and assured that our Jewish identity was such a core part of who we are. The way I look at it, for those in North America and other countries where there was such a sense of security and safety and integration, that whether your Jewish identity was first a part of your identity or last was a luxury that was afforded to those of us who were there. So where do we find that middle ground? Of course, feeling secure, feeling safe and integrated is a good thing. I cherish it now as an American. I don't want to be reminded that I'm a Jew every time I step out of my house, or my children do. But I do want that desire in their heart and their soul to remain Jewish and to continue our Jewish traditions in them. So how do we bring these two worlds together? And how do we not do it out of fear? What worries me is what has happened since October 7th. And I think my children are perfect examples. I have 3 adult children, in their 20s and early 30s. And they were progressive Jews that the rug was pulled out from under them on October 7th, when they woke up and saw that none of their friends, none of their organizations they were engaged with showed up for them. And then they turned into a more Jewishly way on a daily basis, right? Wearing their Magen David. My kids didn't wear Magen David before. They do so now.
Wow.
But I think there are many in our progressive Jewish communities who are still lost, who are still, I don't think we have the institutional language to both support them and to also say, stay where you are. You can continue to be progressives. You can continue to believe in social justice for the real notion of what was behind this movement of social justice, and stay Jewish and stay pro-Israel. Let's fight for that space. Let's not just give up. Let's just not move away and isolate ourselves. And encourage, whether it's faculty on campuses who are doing that frontline. Those are the frontline people in my view, who are out there still fighting in academia to remain not only Jewish, but also Zionist, openly Zionist. I heard yesterday this wonderful thing from the Jewish faculty at University of Toronto are starting this effort to add on their signatures associate faculty positions with Israeli universities. It's a purely symbolic act, right?
Mm.
They're going to continue teaching at the University of Toronto. They're going to do what they're doing, but they're going to take on a new title as associate faculty of an Israeli university. So these are important muscles that we're building to say, okay, we know where we are with Israel. We are in progressive spaces, and academia is a progressive space that has to have its own reckoning, by the way, Nate. I mean, the problems with academia run way deeper in anti-Semitism, and it's about dogma, and it's about activists, professors coming into the classroom rather than being educators, being more activists and maybe radicalizers in their way. So I think allowing our young, and I think the real challenge for us is that generational divide. We're seeing it everywhere. We have to be able to speak to our youth and non-Jewish youth in a way that we have kind of not done so well. I don't think we've done well by using our traditional narratives to speak to youth, both in our progressive spaces, in the Jewish community and outside. So, finding that balance, I think, is critically important. And those of us who came from, vulnerable societies can speak to that a little bit. But I want to be careful that we don't use fear as the only tactic to do that.
Mm.
I would add, if I can add to that, I would say two things. First of all, couldn't agree more that we can't present Jews with an alternative of either be progressive or be Zionist. It's just not going to work. We're going to lose in that thing. We need to create spaces in which you can be truly Zionist and truly progressive, because the so-called progressives are not really progressive. If you don't, if you condone, mass rape, you're not progressive. Don't call yourself a feminist, right? Like, Jews can really say, no, we're the true progressives here, and we're not abandoning the field to the pseudo progressives. That's one thing. I agree with Sharon that the rot in academia is extremely deep, and we will take a generation to fix. It's not like you can change the president, it's not going to change anything. If you ask me, what is the best response to anti-Semitism? Or the first, not the best, Jewish education. I mean, I think that again, anti-Semites cannot be allowed to define what Judaism is. We need to define that, and our kids should not learn Zionism from the anti-Zionists, should not learn Judaism from the anti-Semites. We need to redouble our efforts in Jewish education. Interestingly, people are there. People are flocking to Jewish institutions. After October 7, it's so pervasive, that phenomenon, that we even have a name for it. We call it the surge, right? There's a surge in interest in Jewish education and Jewish participation. Prisma, for example, the day school umbrella, reports a 34% increase in transfer requests from non-Jewish schools to Jewish day schools. So we need to capitalize on that moment. It sounds terrible when I say it like that, but that's what we have to do. We need to use that moment to rebuild Jewish life and to keep investing in Jewish education. There is no justification in the world for the fact that in the biggest, most prosperous, richest community in the history of the Jewish people, day schools are not affordable.
Mm-hmm.
There's no justification. It can't. How can we justify that self? We're the richest Jewish community that ever existed, and kids cannot afford day school. Can't be. And yes, it is an emergency. So funders, and I work with funders day in and day out, and my job sometimes is, tell truth to power, telling them, they pay me to tell them what others won't tell them, right? And one of the things that I tell them is, like, this is the time to give boldly. If it's an emergency, act like it.
Right.
In other words, give until you feel it. It's not like, don't stick to your 5%, whatever. Like, I ask funders all the time. I said, how did you change your lifestyle since October 7 to meet this emergency?
Wow.
Yeah.
Which is And that's what, if not, let's stop saying it's an emergency, right? We can't have it both ways. But I think that we need to do both things. We need to keep defending ourselves, but it's critically important. I totally agree with Sharon. We can't have a Jewish identity based on fear or based on fighting anti-Semitism. It's just not enough. Not enough for this generation. I mean, Jews, and especially young Jews, are seekers. They're looking for meaning. They're looking for purpose. They're looking for belonging, right? And we need to give them that. We can't just tell them, like imagine a club that says they want to kill us, join. Like it just doesn't work like that, right? So we need to really double that, and believe me, there are resources enough to do everything. If you just an interesting tidbit about giving in the United States, Americans give in charity 2.4% of the GDP. Only 2.4%. There's and Jews are in the same. Jews are like between 2.4 and 2.9, depending on the year. There is a lot of room to grow. A lot of room to grow.
Wow. Sandy, you want to go?
Yeah, I wanted to add a couple of things. First of all, again, I agree with my colleagues on this, that Judaism, the future of Judaism is not bright if it's based solely on fear. But I want to say two things. I mean, there's lots to say, but two things. Number one, I do want to be clear that we're talking about the North American Jewish community, at least primarily, as if it's monolithic, and it certainly is not. And some of the things that we're saying are not true as far as the Orthodox community is concerned.
Absolutely.
I'm actually pretty optimistic about the future of North American Jewry in the Orthodox community. There seems to be growth. There seems to be excitement. Now that's a lifestyle, right? So what we're basically talking is more, not just a religion, but it's a lifestyle. The lifestyle is reinforcing in a way that maybe is not the balance that many of us would want, that Sharon talks about, because it's a balance in a different direction, but it's there. And so there's something we can learn, I think, that is non-Orthodox Jewish, North American Jewry can learn from the Orthodox Jewish community, the same way that there's something we can learn from the very community Sharon was talking about. What can we as North American Jews learn from the communities of Australia, of Latin America, of Europe, of what it means, even of the former Soviet Union, Russia and all that, where religion was banned, but 70 years later, Judaism still emerged, right? What can we have to remember, we can learn from each other. And that's what this whole notion of the global people, what can we learn from all over the globe, what we can learn from each other. And one last point, I think it's incredibly important. Sharon was talking about the narrative. We don't have the language, right? We don't have the language. Well, I'd say it's even worse than I think what Sharon says, because it's not just that we don't have the language that appeals to Jewish kids or kids who identify as Jewish. We live in North America where in the non-Orthodox community, the intermarriage rate is somewhere around 80%, right? So the North American Jewish community is completely different from what it was 3 or 4 decades ago, right? There aren't the 2 Jews marrying and having Jewish kids. It doesn't work like that. But our language, our liturgical language, our communal language, all of our language is still geared towards this nuclear Jewish group that doesn't exist. And we need to change that, because as we move forward, regardless of where you are on the spectrum, individual Jews are not going to be part of something that excludes a partner or a child or a grandparent or whatever. And we have to learn a new narrative. Sharon is absolutely right. We have to learn a new narrative, both for Jews and for the community, so that we are much more inclusive of the partners that the Jewish community has. And we see them as part of our community and allies to our community.
Thank you. That's really, really so important. All right, we have questions are coming in like hotcakes, so I'm going to do my best to get to all of these. And we'll maybe do this kind of as a lightning round, because I know we have limited time. So the first question, I think actually, Sandy, I'm going to direct it to you. It's from Tova Hellerstein, and she says, I want to hear practical and pragmatic suggestions on how to get to this place of coordination, or at the very least, information sharing, not hoarding. Or Sandy, or maybe Andreas, if you wanted to give your quick take on that question.
Can you repeat the question? I didn't.
How do we do better on coordinating and not, what are some practical suggestions for getting people to work together?
Well, let me respond quickly, Andres, and I'll leave it to you, and you can bring in. First of all, we need the resources to do that. The resources now are being directed to all these 160. There's no one who is really doing the coordinated approach. ADL, to some extent, is trying to do that, but they also have the work that they need to do of their own. So we need resources from philanthropy to be directed to bringing these people together. It's going to be extraordinarily difficult to do it over Zoom and over calls. It's not going to work. You don't have the trust. You don't have the connection. We need to find ways to find who these people are, to bring them together and to talk about it. It's Tova. It's not easy. It's not easy work. We haven't been able to do it as a community probably for 4,000 years, but we need to figure out how to use technology and use the resources at our disposal to do it best. But I think you're going to have to put the people in the room. We also need a plan. We also need something, even if it's a straw person, we need something that people see. What does coordination look like? Where do you put the messaging people? Where do you put the platform people? Where do you put the motivation of people on the ground? And where do we put academia? Most of these organizations don't have that plan. They have one thing they think is going to solve the problem, which is not going to happen. And even if they were going to be extraordinarily successful, it has to be within a broader context. So we need a plan. We need to bring the people together. That's how we can take a start at this.
Two ways. One is it needs to start with the funders. I mean, somebody is funding this 160 organization. So if you come to me with a proposal for a new organization to fight anti-Semitism, as a funder, I should say, wait a second. Let's see who else is doing this first. And I'm not going to fund you to start a new one when it's, go and work with them. Or if I am going to fund you, I gotta, put as a condition that you work with them. That's the first. So that's the stick part. The carrot part is that organizations have to feel that they have a lot to gain by doing this coordination. Let me show you a quick example from a member of JFN, Alan Feld, who created something called Oct7, October 7, which is really a backend platform to help organization maximize their impact. So you're part of the coordinating mechanism. We're going to share with you, research that you don't have on your own. We're going to share with you what we know about the different algorithms. But for that, you need to be part of the shared platform. Now, that's the carrot, right? You miss out by not being part of that coordinated mechanism. It's not going to be easy. And listen, the other thing is that the Jewish community, and not just in this space, the Jewish community never had good birth control and never had good hospice care in terms of Jewish organization. A lot of organizations spring up and they never die. So we say it's a startup economy. Great, but in a startup economy, 90% of startups don't make it to the next stage. So we can't have it both ways. If we let a million flowers bloom, we need to know that 90% of them are gonna die. And we need to let them, we need to help them die in a way. So that's part of the challenge there too.
That's really important. I want to bundle a couple questions together for Sharon. And there's been already in the chat a lot of people speaking to how much your message has resonated with them about how to deal in these progressive spaces. And there's a lot of questions sort of surrounding how do we help keep that seat at the table? And also sort of as part of that, how do we deal with Jewish organizations purporting to speak for the Jewish community who are anti-Zionist, who are trying to uncouple Judaism and Zionism, and dealing with that challenging question right now? I guess I'll direct it to Dr. Nazarian.
Look, we saw that coming on campuses with JVP starting their activity, I would say about 10 years ago. And that's a true challenge. And that's something that we missed as a community. I mean, I can tell you with my work at ADL, we saw these alternative narratives coming from those purporting to be Jews and then speaking for the Jewish community. Now, we as a community have a lot of credibility. And I just wrote, for example, for USA Today, a 10-point plan for university administrators about how to welcome back Jewish students safely to their campuses this academic year, given the horrors of last year. And the point I put in there is pay attention to which Jewish groups you're listening to. If you're using the voices of these fringe groups who purport to reflect the broader society, and yet the bigger groups are not there, you're in the wrong place. So it is on you. It is the responsibility of the administrators, not just sit with JVP and I talk about anti-Semitism on campus. We have to hold them to task, and we have to be at those tables, and we have to say, you have the responsibility of making sure that you have representative bodies talking about what is happening to the Jewish students, for example, on campus, in other places as well. So look, we have to understand the other side was way more organized. They were much more prepared, and we saw what happened on October 8th. We saw what happened in every capital around the world. We saw what happened in every campus and major universities and cities around the world. So we kind of, we went back on our heels a little bit. And I think, Andreas, the 160 to me is not, it is worrisome because we're not coordinated. But it shows that as a people, we're like in there. We're jumping now, and we're catching up, and we're doing what we need to be doing. We need to coordinate better. But it is very important that we don't give up any space. We should not be giving up any space from the progressive to the center to the right. And one of the things I talk often about is calling out anti-Semitism and bad behavior in our own camps. That we're not good at, and we should do more of that.
Yeah.
We need to hold our own political leaders, our own other stakeholders in our own camp. Once we start doing that, we will move the needle, I promise you. And I've done that as someone who works on civil rights and looking at, fighting hate globally. I will put the label of extremism on anyone on the far left that is spewing anti-Semitism, anti-Israel hate. I will call them extremist that moment. And we have to get all of us to speak about extremism in our own camp and why it is a cancer in our camp. So I think there's a lot to be done there. But in those progressive spaces, whether you're an artist or you're a playwright or you're an academic, your voice matters, and get the silent majority. We know that the loudest ones are the most extremist ones right now, unfortunately. There's huge silent majorities in every one of those sub-communities sitting on the sideline, either too afraid or feeling pressured to not say anything. There's a lot of social pressure in these spaces, in progressive spaces. And look, we're already seeing that crack in the African-American community. Look what happened when Vice President Harris was nominated to be the candidate for the Democratic Party. And the pro-Hamas said to the African-American community, don't you dare support her. And they said, what are you talking about? This is our candidate. Now it's your turn to be our ally. It's your turn to come and stand with us. And there's a deepening crack that's showing up there. We need to do the same with the LGBT community. That hasn't happened yet. I don't know why the LGBT community continues to be activists against their own interests. So we have to figure that out, and we have to crack that nut. The Latino community, the Asian American community, by the way, the Asian American youth are some of the most radical against Israel today. If you go on campuses, SJP members are many are Latin, from Asian American descent. Why is that? What is it that's speaking to them? Why is the pressure on them to align with pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas groups? What is that pressure that's driving them? We have to understand that. And only those in progressive spaces can do that job. They have credibility, they have legitimacy, and they have the language and the narrative to do that and to call out the racism, to call out the homophobia. I mean, look what happens at pride parades. The pro-Hamas groups are going in there and demonstrating against pride parades, and that, queers for Palestine, they're getting in shouting matches with one another. So we have to help them along to understand they're on the wrong side here. So it's on us and those in the progressive spaces to tackle that, to be there, both as an ally, but also using narratives that speak to them.
I think Sharon, I agree with every word there. I think it's really important to say, to be clear about who represents at least the majority of the Jewish community, the overwhelming majority. And I think that it starts by the Jewish community doing something that we were afraid to do, which is to be clear about the boundaries, the ideological boundaries of the Jewish community. We believe in, we don't have to exclude anybody and whatever. But I think in moments like this, we need to be assertive. We need to say, sorry, if you believe that Israel has no right to exist, you don't belong in the Jewish community. I mean, yes, we can't say you're not Jewish, halachically you're still Jewish, but it's the same way if you believe that, Jesus is the Messiah. We'll tell you, God bless you, but you're not part of the Jewish community. So we, the Jewish community, need to be much more assertive about how we define boundaries and how we communicate to others those boundaries. This is not rocket science. 95% of Jews, including young Jews, are Zionist. There's a lot of nomenclature problem here. People may say, I'm an anti-Zionist, and when you ask them, wait a minute, what does that mean? Oh, that I'm against Bibi. Well, I'm against Bibi too. I'm not an anti-Zionist. Oh no, so there's an education process there. But once the education process is done, I think we need to be very assertive. We don't need to be afraid to draw boundaries and to communicate those boundaries very aggressively, and to allow a very vocal minority, as you said, to dominate the conversation. Listen, it literally takes 5 people to block the Brooklyn Bridge and be on the news. It's 5 people. Many of these anti-Israel demonstrations, many of the anti-Israel resolutions in universities, you know how they pass. It's basically they make an assembly last for 17 hours at 4 in the morning in a Sunday. There's 15 people in the room. Somebody proposes an anti-Israel resolution and they win, right? It's the system doesn't have the antibodies to defend itself against these very radical and very vocal minorities, and we need to help them do that.
Go
ahead.
Nate, I was just going to say the takeaway, I think, from what Sharon and Andres have said. Look, I think 2 big things. Number one, we've got to show up. We've got to be there. Regardless of where it is, as Sharon says, we have to be there. We cannot relinquish any place. We have to be there. I think that I agree with you, Sharon, that the 160 organizations is a good sign. It's not a good sign that they're not cooperating and collaborating, but it's a good sign that people care. Funders are showing up. There is the surge. There are people coming back to the community. So we're beginning to see that, but we need to do more. We need to animate and activate our Jewish communities more, so we get more people to show up and to engage. The second thing, which I heard from both, is clearly it's courage. We need courage. We need the courage to call people out. We need the courage not to be afraid, not to hide during this time of being Jewish, and to, as Andre said, to define for the world, for ourselves, what the Jewish community means. We have to have the courage to do things that we haven't done for a while. And if we show up and we show that courage, we can again, we're not going to eliminate anti-Semitism, but we can take over the battle, and we can control the narrative, and we can make things much, much better on campus, in boardrooms, on social media, in the media in general, and in our communities. And I think that's what this is all about. And that's the big takeaway from today.
I think that's a great final word, Sandy. As we have many questions that came in. I will encourage guests, if your question wasn't answered, feel free to send an email. We will try to respond after the fact. I'm really grateful to each of you for tremendous insights at this really important moment. I say often, I think there's been, certainly in our lifetime, no more important time to be a Jew or a Jewish leader thinking about these issues and trying to drive change. And we're really lucky that we have these 3 folks on this call at the forefront of this work. So we're grateful to them. I'm grateful to you as a Jew, and as a convener of a very interesting panel. This conversation will be available for folks who weren't able to join, and we'll make the recording available to everybody on the call. And if you have additional questions, we will send a follow-up, and you can feel free to reply to me. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Dr. Nazarian, Sandy, Andres. We're grateful to each of you, and we'll be back soon with another great panel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, and Shana Tova.
Great.
Shana
Thank you.
Tova.
Thank you. Shana Tova.
Bye, everyone. Shana Tova.